And we're very, very excited to get started with this next talk from Tatiana called Organizational Buy-in, the Unexpectedly Difficult Part About Testing. And just a little bit about Tatiana, who is a software engineer at Streamlabs by Logitech. She's got a background in full stack development and specializes in testing. She's a self-taught software engineer who transitioned from higher ed to software engineering during the height of the pandemic, finding her first role in HR tech at Lever. She's got a background in open source, worked on the Odin project as the core maintainer for 2 years, which is super awesome. And she developed and wrote programming lessons, project guidelines, and contributed to the code base of a site that was visited by millions of aspiring software engineers. We're really happy to have her here, especially because she strives to engage minority communities and their journeys into tech and focuses on supporting underserved communities. In her spare time, she streams Apex Legends and Valorant on Twitch using Streamlabs software. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Tatiana for this amazing session. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm having a great time. And I appreciate it. I appreciate y'all showing up. All right, what's up, y'all? My name is Tatiana Walton, and today we will be speaking about organizational buy-in, the unexpectedly difficult part about testing. So, a little bit about me. I'm Tati, a software engineer at Streamlabs by Logitech. I currently work on our core suite of web tooling that allows live streamers such as myself to set up the most entertaining and engaging stream possible with as little effort possible. My current focus is implementing testing and establishing best practices across our repositories. I was an administrative assistant at my alma mater, UC Irvine, with dreams of being a director of student services, but I found myself pretty mentally unstimulated and not loving the work. Over a year and a half, I poured a ton of my energy into learning web development, even made a couple scripts to make my job easier so I could spend more time learning to code even while I was on the job. During my time learning, I was invited to be a part of the maintainer team for the Odin project, an online open source curriculum that is used by millions yearly. There, I helped write curriculum, developed and tested new features for our site, and tutored thousands of students on Discord personally one-on-one. Over time, I secured a full-time role at Lever, an HR tech startup, where I got to dive into testing deeply under the guidance of Christina Berger, who actually has an amazing panel later on today. From there, I learned the importance of testing meaningfully, and making it easy for developers to test. So, why talk about buy-in? It's not very technical, but we have a lot of very talented and smart people that are diving into more technical topics later on today. The entire process of organizational change is very near and dear to me, and I think as engineers, it's something that we need to be very privy to. I was approached by a Streamlabs recruiter about a year into my tenure at Lever, and throughout the process, I asked about testing procedures for the team I was intended to work with, which is the core web team. I was pretty shocked to find out for a product that is used by millions, because we are the #1 leader in our field, testing was pretty much non-existent. It was a cause of great concern for me and almost stopped me from signing on to Streamlabs. However, I took it as an opportunity, and I made it clear after setting up many meetings with other developers and leadership prior to signing my contract that I would make it my personal mission to implement testing and address tech debt. So, with so much enthusiasm that I had with folks who were excited about my goals that I had upon joining Streamlabs, I thought that being a force of change would be really easy, but I quickly found that buy-in, for testing especially, is unexpectedly difficult. I thought I had the proper stakeholders in place to immediately execute upon being onboarded, and this was of course naive. I didn't take the time to consider the existing development process and where testing could fit into that, nor the developer attitudes towards testing, nor our existing tech stack. Between getting developers to, help and ensuring that testing is seen as a priority by upper management and sourcing the testing stack, getting buy-in is pretty difficult and not just as easy as saying, hey, let's test, let's do it. So there are tons of talks and articles about getting testing set up in an easy manner, how to leverage popular frameworks and tools, but not quite as much on the stakeholder aspect and getting folks to want to test if your organization doesn't already test. And that's the first hurdle before any package, tooling, or framework comes into play. And ultimately, It's like selling shoes. Pitching any product that doesn't have some sort of financial return or isn't client facing is a lot like trying to sell shoes. Back in the day, my job in college was working at Adidas Originals, and that was probably my favorite job because I found out I was really good at selling things. I boasted top sales on most days that I was in, partially because I truly loved our products, but I found that making people feel good about their investment in clothes, shoes, or whatever they may be interested in helped seal the deal and turned a t-shirt sale into a full outfit and sneakers sale. So, like how I would make people feel good and confident about their investment into our products, we got to make people feel good and confident about testing and its effects on our team, our product, and our organization at large. For upper management, the risk in pursuing testing would be money. For devs, the risk is time. So making them feel really great and solid in this investment, no matter what the stakes are dependent on their role, will pave the way for your implementation project for testing. So when I was selling shoes for a living, I had to navigate through dozens of reasons why folks didn't want to make a purchase. It wasn't in their budget, they didn't really like it, they weren't sure if it fit their style, things like that. Similarly, when we're trying to drive forward a testing implementation at our organization, we need to understand and properly address some of the most common reasons why an organization doesn't test, because you'll see them over and over again at many different organizations. So, here are a few reasons why. The first is it's not sexy, and I understand that. It's not very fun. What I mean by that is it's not very fun. It's not super exciting. It can honestly be seen as a drag, and I completely understand that. As someone who loves testing, I'm a little bit biased, but I get why other people think of it like that. The second reason is it can be time consuming, especially to get set up. We've all probably wrestled with implementations of getting CI up, making sure that we have the proper frameworks in place that play nice with, the front end frameworks that we may be using. So it can be a little bit time consuming on top of having to add tests to your pull requests. I get that, completely valid. It adds overhead, period, is another reason why people don't test, why organizations don't like to test. And I can't deny that. Again, writing tests, adding them to your pull requests, checking them, making sure they pass, it does add overhead. You can't deny that. Checks can also be an additional step to hot fixes. And if you're an organization that likes to build fast and fail fast so you can build and fix things fast, hot fix is pretty integrated into your development process. So having an additional check of needing to write tests or making sure tests pass, no matter what you're putting on production, that can also be another barrier to why folks do not want to test, because they don't want to go through that. They just want to push out hot fixes. Another very, very common reason why folks don't test is because it's not driving the product forward like a new feature would. Again, extremely valid, because you are taking time away from, potentially developing new features or building out existing features to basically kind of preemptively bug bash. So also a very valid reason why folks don't test. And finally, a very common reason that I've heard from other friends who have organizations that don't test is that they simply just have not been testing since the product was built. So why bother? Things have been fine. And while I disagree with that, I do understand that that is also a driving factor, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So before we head down this journey of trying to actually implement the test, we need to settle a few items first before we attempt to garner support. A little bit like my time in retail, we need to figure out what the actual needs are before we start to pitch something that folks need to invest in. So this begins with evaluating our code base. Let's look at where the most bugs are reported, whether it's internally or by our users via Zendesk or some other reporting tool. We need to look for areas where a poor user experience might cause churn and a loss of revenue. So, for example, at Streamlabs, we recently just rolled out an entirely new checkout experience on Streamlabs.com, and it also integrates with some of our other seed products that live on other domains. This is our main source of revenue, and tests have been highly requested, and we also recently implemented a testing pipeline because of the risks at stake if the user experience is poor or there are bugs. And there was literally a crashing bug last week that could have been caught by tests. We wrote tests, and I actually approved the pull request this morning to implement those tests. So we need to look at those kind of high touch points that are on the client facing side, because we don't want to lose money as an organization. And then we also want to look at areas of the code base where a number of engineers are frequently touching it, or changes are frequently being made, because that's where we'll see the highest risk for bugs to also be introduced. Alternatively, we also may want to look for areas that are low risk and more of a small product area that could be easy to spin up a really quick, small pipeline for, so you can also show folks the value of tests on a very small scale before you roll it out to perhaps the greater code base at large. Now, the next part would be garnering support. We need to search for sympathizers. We need to kind of get a litmus test of how folks feel about testing and find those who are proactive and positive about tests rather than detractors. So we need to garner as much support as possible across roles and look up and across. So folks that we might want to look towards are other developers who may be frustrated by the development process. I know early on in my tenure, because I made testing such a focus for myself and for my work at Streamlabs, I was frequently asking other devs that I was meeting or working with how they felt about a lack of testing, how they felt about testing, and kind of wanted to see who I could draw upon later on when I put the grand plan into motion. And this isn't also limited to devs. There are other roles such as design or marketing whose work might be impacted by a lack of testing, or they might frequently be players who are submitting bug reports or requesting hotfixes. I know for myself, last week, we had an issue where marketing wasn't getting the proper data from our pixels on checkout, and this could have been easily solved if there were tests that expressed to us whether or not the proper events were being sent through our functions that handled our pixels. So don't just think of it as a dev issue. Think cross-functionally, and who might be in support of testing, because it'll make their role and their lives a lot easier. An obvious one you might want to look to is the individual you report to. We want to express how a lack of testing at your organization can be a detriment to not only your working process, but maybe the working process of your immediate team around you or other folks across the organization as well. And then, the final boss would be folks in middle and upper management who may be interested in having a more efficient dev team despite the time you'd be taking away from maybe moving the product forward. So early in my tenure, as I mentioned, I set up a lot of meetings with different folks across my organization, or my soon-to-be organization, Streamlabs, to ensure that I would want to sign on. One of those folks was Ashley, who is the head of growth. About, a few weeks into my tenure, we had a one-on-one meeting. I expressed that, again, like I said in my interviews, I want to implement testing. I really want to dive into things and just take it head first. That didn't happen. So 6 months in, at our holiday party, I took her aside, doubled down that testing was a project that I really wanted to helm, and I outlined a lot of the brittleness I had seen in our development process in my very short time at Streamlabs, which was, again, about 6 months deep. She became a really key support for the project as I began to politic the project forward and start to bring it to fruition rather than making it just an idea. So I encourage folks to find, similarly strong supporters with enough clout and sway to help get your project through the earliest pitch stages, because testing is something that a lot of people don't want to do, but ultimately we sort of need to do. So we really need some key stakeholders who can shift the needle for us if our enthusiasm alone isn't going to be enough. And to be clear, at this point, we're looking for backup. We're not looking to convince folks. We're not trying to get folks who hate testing to suddenly love testing. We simply want to get a litmus test of people who are already ardent supporters of testing, so we can sort of drive the project forward once we get to that stage of needing to convince folks. Now, the final stage of getting started would be actually getting a solid plan in place. We've looked at parts of the code base that could benefit from testing. We have, a critical mass of folks who we can draw upon to, show support for this endeavor. And now we need to have some sort of semblance of the stack that we're going to use for testing. We don't need all the answers at this point. We don't need a specific technical implementation, but it's good to have an understanding of the general testing pipeline before we speak to other folks to pitch this a little bit more formally. So the first thing you need is to consider the quality of resources, because if we're establishing an entirely new pipeline or maybe fixing an old pipeline that has been abandoned, like I am right now, we need folks to be able to refer to a number of resources, whether it's for writing the tests themselves, debugging the tests, or understanding how the overall pipeline works, whether it's CI or locally. So we should consider tools that are leveraged across the industry, pretty, very popular tools, because we know where they're going to be well documented on platforms such as, Stack Overflow, Reddit, or in their official documentation. And we have areas where folks can help, get help troubleshooting, see discussion on best practices that can help you develop your own best practices for your organization, and really just increase the likelihood that the devs on your team are already familiar with the tooling. Using tooling that other devs are familiar with will be extremely helpful, as it removes the barrier of learning an entirely new tool that's been now added onto their already probably lengthy development process. So at Streamlabs, I've considered all these things as I'm currently in the process of reestablishing our pipeline on core. We had some existing but abandoned end-to-end tests that use Cypress, and because so much of the team already had experience with Cypress, I also used it at Lever. I decided that we should retain it and update it to the newest version for our pipeline. It's easy to use, has a super user-friendly dashboard to record and view test runs, which was a really big selling point for my team when I decided to reinstate these tests. And it integrated really nicely with the CI tooling we're using. Although I did find out Applitools has an SDK for Cypress, and that might be something I might want to look towards in the future as I've finished reestablishing our pipelines at work. So we have a general plan. We have folks who are generally supportive. We have the overall general technical, outlook that we're looking to pursue, but that's not enough. Chances are we need to officially get this testing implementation on the roadmap for our team or for our organization and ensure that, resources and other developers can be allotted to this project to help drive it forward, because you can't do it all alone, especially if you're front end heavy. There might be a lot of infrastructural items that you're going to need to establish these pipelines. So we need to probably convince those who are on the fence, those who are not in our particular purview of development, or those who are even just blocking testing entirely. This is the hard part, convincing folks to buy in. So we want to appeal to devs first and foremost. Devs are going to be our allies. Folks are already working on their own projects, so pitching another piece of the development process that ultimately does add to their workload, if we're being honest, is a fine-tuned dance on a tightrope that we need to finesse and navigate very carefully. It can make you a little bit unpopular to propose what is seen as red tape, so we need to be empathetic towards other developers in our conversations about implementing testing. We need to make sure that we make it clear that we are aware of other folks' ongoing projects and emphasize that we aren't striving for things like 100% code coverage. Kind of making it seem like testing is going to be laying down the law is going to make some folks draw back, because again, they have a lot going on. You don't want to make testing overwhelming. It needs to be a slow trickle. And we need to emphasize that this implementation is that slow trickle and consider a pathway where implementing testing will not be blocking to any work that's being done, at least for some time. Devs are going to need time to acclimate, learn how do you test, and implement the tests into either new work or the work that they currently have going on. So we need to be careful about, blocking PRs, pull requests, before, tests are written, or if code coverage, comes into play. Need to be careful about immediately just blocking PRs once we sort of cut over to implementing testing. We need to also appeal to the ease of the developer's experience. We want to make it easier to implement new features, not harder. Like I said, a lot of devs dislike testing because it can be considered difficult. It takes a little bit of time. We should strive to set up testing practices and tooling that minimize the time that devs spend on writing tests themselves, but we'll get a little bit more into that later and how to do that. We just want to make it easier for devs to roll out new features because we know they're safe, and we don't need to double back and fix something broken that's been pushed to prod. That's where we want to save our time. But with that, we need to be honest. Testing does take time, and we need to be upfront about that. Testing is not magical and going to save us from every bug. It's preventative. So we need to use a metaphor, sort of like a piggy bank. We're front-loading the time and spending time on tests so we can save time later on fixing bugs and pushing out hot fixes. But we need to be completely honest about what testing does and what testing doesn't do in regards to the development process. Now, like I said earlier, appealing to management is a little bit like the final boss, because they will likely determine if you have the bandwidth to implement testing, which again can take time away from the product itself. At Streamlabs, I've been working with a handful of folks to get our pipelines off the ground again for the last probably 3 or 4 months, and we are finally getting the pipeline pull request approved this week. So that's a lot of man hours that myself and the other devs who've been working on this could have been spending on projects to, develop new products or to improve our existing ones. That is a lot of man hours, and that can be a hard sell because upper management may often be a little bit more product minded and worried about pressing out, new features constantly. That's the crux of the battle, is balancing product development, which would be new features, expanding features and new products, versus product stability. So we have to be able to confidently express why yourselves and other engineers should be able to take that time away from delivering these new features. We need numbers. So what a good thing to do would be is to look at the pull requests that you've made or others have made that are hot fixes or bug fixes. kind of get an estimate about the man hours spent on those that could have possibly been prevented by tests or by, some sort of early flagging. And that would be a great way to convey the level of efficiency that we may be missing out on by not having tests. And then this is where you could also draw on that support I had mentioned earlier of the folks who were already proponents of testing, but, just haven't gotten to it for whatever reason. It's one thing if you bring this to upper management as an individual who sees the value in tests, and that was me for a while. I kind of just kept saying, hey, I like testing. Let me do it. But I was never allocated the time, never allocated the resources. But once I had a team around me and I was like, hey, these folks, they want testing. This department is requesting testing. Hey, I think this could make so-and-so's lives easier if we had tests around this. That makes it a lot more palatable for folks in upper management to say, hey, maybe we should actually allocate time for this on the roadmap, because if it's not on the roadmap, it often doesn't exist. And it's really important to get priority for testing or addressing technical debt on your company's official development roadmap. So, that's nice and all, but what if there are some squeaky wheels regardless of all of this? So the head of engineering actually asked me to deliver a talk internally about testing about a month ago to help garner even more stakeholders because I needed help to implement our pipelines. I can't do it all myself. And when I previewed that talk for a friend, she was afraid that folks would be offended or maybe just less privy to wanting to test because of what I was saying. And I get it. I have a really big personality. I'm coming up in there and saying our current processes are less than ideal, that we've gained a lot of tech debt because of a lack of testing over the years. And I can see how that might not go over well because I'm barely a year in and there are a lot of folks who have been there for many years and, they're okay with how things have been going. So if my delivery wasn't tactful, it could go completely south. I get it, but I also wanted to make it clear that this is still important. Testing is important and we need to do it regardless. And we need to ensure that when we want to implement something like testing, which is going to expose a lot of the faultiness or weaknesses in our code bases, it's not personal. This is an us and a we endeavor. So this is why it's very important to get not only folks who already support, but make sure that people who are on the other side of the fence also come over to this side because again, this is a collective, endeavor. People are all going to need to write tests and it's on all of us to maintain the health of our code bases. So we're investing in an endeavor for all of us. We're investing time and ultimately money for all of us. There's no glory. We just want to make lives easier. And it's not an attack on those who haven't implemented testing. When we come forward with the testing plan, we're not blaming the folks who were here before us or are currently here for the lack of tests and the tech debt. It's a blameless game. It needs to be postured as something to improve the current health of something that we have all contributed to. It's completely valid reasons why folks don't test, but we need to show that this is going to be a cultural shift for our engineering teams and nobody is at fault. And again, we want to make it easy and fun for people. We are here as change makers for those of us who want to implement tests. This is no small feat. This is a really big deal to implement tests, especially in an organization that has none. So we need to leverage those who are excited and enthusiastic and those with the knowledge so we can get the hard part out of the way, which is generally the actual implementation part of getting a pipeline set up and getting packages set up and what have you. So finally, we have, gotten all of our stakeholders in place. Let's say that, yes, we have testing on our official roadmap. It's now our responsibility to implement it. Shocking. So we need to begin by selecting and assessing the type and breadth of tests to implement. We need to know how deep we want to go with testing and where to start with them. It's going to be a slow process. Like I said, we are not going to have a hard cutover date of when we're going to have all these tests on production, right? We have massive code bases, legacy code bases that we can't just have a fully fledged suite of unit integration and E2E tests all at once. Go low and slow and go more complex later. So let's, start a tech spec so we can outline the testing needs and the final tooling that we're going to use for our pipeline. This will serve as a reference moving forward for the developer team. And then from there, as mentioned earlier, we need to ensure that there are resources available for folks to get accustomed to the tooling used. So we want to do things like create a testing style guide. That's going over naming of the tests, what to test, when to test, the file structure and directories. We want to make sure that the implementation is clean because if you've made things more difficult, more confusing, it's a lot to parse, people aren't going to want to add to that. And then we need to also consider making an internal testing package to make it easier. At Lever, we had an internal package called Lever Test, which helped us, generate the testing files. It generated, objects from our database that we could use in the testing. And it really took away a lot of the difficult work of actually getting a test kind of scaffolded up just so we could do, a couple small assertions. Now, you also need to make sure that you outline debugging steps and what to do if CI is failing so other devs can have a level of independence. At Lever, we had a very, very thorough doc on Confluence to debug tests. We flagged notoriously flaky tests. And this allowed folks who weren't really as strong in testing or familiar with testing to at least know what to do and how to investigate, because you really want to make it a team effort and not just a you effort after tests are implemented. But you'll likely be the point person here, at least for some time. So create open channels such as on Slack or on Teams, whatever communication tool y'all use, so it can serve as a repository of knowledge and folks can, again, get onboarded more quickly. There can be more education surrounding tests because it's likely there are people who are not as strong in testing because your organization hasn't done it for however long they have. And then another thing you can also do is setting up a working group. Those are super useful. We use them at Lever, and I'm trying to establish one at Streamlabs. It's really helpful to set up some retroactive tests because, you do need to go back and implement tests to already existing code. And it also just helps people really level up on their testing skills and just has everybody make it a communal effort because, again, it's an us and a we problem when it comes to implementing testing, not just the person who wants to drive testing and implement testing forward. That's all. Thank you very much. I hope that if your organization isn't testing, you found this helpful and you can get a testing pipeline set up pretty soon. Thank you.
Welcome back. I want to thank you, Tatiana, for that amazing session. I really appreciated what person-centered approach that you used, really talking about like getting everybody in together, having that buy-in, being empathetic while doing it, the honesty, and you had some really great metaphors there that I really
Thank you.
Before we get into some of the questions, I wanted to take a look at the polls. So if you haven't voted in the poll yet, I don't know if you still can or not, but first one was, have you ever worked at an organization with little to no testing? Oh, we're changing up. Okay, so this is definitely live. So Tatiana, you want to talk a little bit about the inspiration for this question?
Yeah, like I said, at my first organization, my first job out there, we were testing thoroughly. We had a ton of systems in place regarding testing. Christina Berger had a huge hand in those. Again, go see her talk, y'all. Please go see her talk. When I went to Streamlabs, I was pretty shocked that for a company where, we have millions of users, we are the market leader in the online streaming space. We didn't really have many tests on our core web product. So it was just interesting to see that even though there were so many users, some organizations just don't test because, they want to focus on product, which I completely respect and understand.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. We're going to show that next poll really quickly before we get to the questions. We only have about 2 minutes left, but we're going actually straight to the first question, which are things to consider while choosing a testing framework. And I think that there are some responses, but what do you think?
Yeah, and like I said in the talk, we really want to make sure we pick tools that are either ubiquitous, like they have, widespread documentation, they are sort of leaders at what they do. So, certain frameworks that come to mind would be like Jest or Mocha. And of course you have to look and see if the specifics of the framework are right for you, but you might not want to use some super niche tool unless it is well attuned to your specific setup for your project, for your repository. For example, we're using a Vitest at my job right now. I haven't used it, but a lot of these testing frameworks are very similar and it actually is pretty close to Jest. And we're using it because it works well with our build tooling. But you want to look for something that's well documented, of course, and that's for any tool. You want to look for something that's not going to be overly complex, especially if you're onboarding folks to testing who either aren't very well attuned to testing, don't know a lot about it, or they just don't want to spend a lot of time on tests. And you also do want to consider build time and the time it takes to execute tests. If the framework is slow, you probably don't want to add it, especially to a CI pipeline. So look for something speedy, well documented, and easy to use.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. So we've got one last question then before we move on to the next session, but how do you convince non-tech org leaders to invest in testing for long-term benefits?
Yeah, and this is the thing where ultimately you have to come to people where they are and explain that this is a blocker, that it affects the product itself. You need to come to, like, if you're talking to, say, a marketing manager, their efforts to market are probably not going to be fruitful if someone is onboarded and the product is just completely buggy. If you're talking to someone in finance, you want to describe how spending a lot of time on debugging and fixing bugs is costing them more money in engineering hours, because we know us engineers can be a little bit expensive sometimes. So you really need to understand who you're talking to and how this relates to them, especially if they're non-technical. You need to tell them how it impacts what their purview is.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I just want to say thank you for being here, Tatiana, for all you shared. Everyone, give it up in the chat. Throw up those emojis. Let her know that she did an amazing job. And just